Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Rick Rolled, a live presentation where I bring you to my kitchen table to talk about some of my favorite games. And tonight, we are going to be taking a look once again at the game Steampunk Rally, a game designed by Orrin Bishop and published by Roxley Game Laboratory. Now, last time that you were with me, we were just looking at what was in the box. We did an unboxing video for Steampunk Rally. Tonight, we're actually going to take a closer look, and we're going to be looking at gameplay and how to play. So, welcome, by the way, Paul Saxberg, Amanda, Jonathan. Thanks for joining us. So tonight, we're going to do a quick overview of how the game is played. I'm not going to go super in-depth. Probably play through a couple of rounds just to show you how the game is played so you can make a decision as to whether or not Steampunk Rally is a board game that you would enjoy. Steampunk Rally plays between 2 to 8 players. You can play it in a relatively short amount of time, about 90 minutes, depending on how many people you have. But a lot of the gameplay goes quickly because the turns are actually simultaneous, so you don't have to wait for people to do their thing. You can just all do the steps at the same time, which makes the gameplay go pretty quick. So setup-wise, I have already set up our racetrack. The theme of this, by the way, is we have a bunch of famous inventors and scientists from throughout the course of history who have gathered together in the Swiss Alps, and they're going to have a race to find out who is the absolute best inventor. So tonight I have chosen both Albert Einstein and Thomas Edison, and they're going to be our two players that are going to be racing against each other. And the object of the game is not only do you want to get to the finish line, but you'll notice there's a lot of track that occurs after that. So once one player crosses the finish line, the game is not over. It just triggers the end of the game, and all players will have one final round to push their vehicles as hard as they can to get the furthest along past the finish line. And then at the end of that final round, whoever is the furthest along in the track is the winner of the game. Now, Steampunk Rally involves a couple of different elements. Besides just racing, we're going to see card drafting and dice placement. You see here that I've already gotten out some of the dice. There's lots more in the box, but I just figured this is all I would need for tonight's game. And we're going to have these crazy vehicles. So this is the starting vehicle for Mr. Thomas Edison. And over here, we have the starting vehicle for Mr. Albert Einstein. They both have a cockpit, which is where our scientist or our inventor is driving, and then they start out with one piece of their machine. Now, during the course of the game, you're going to build more and more pieces onto your machine to make it go and make it go more efficiently. I also here have this circular piece. This is not as important in a two-player game. What this does is you flip this at the beginning of any game. Oops, sorry, my fingers got in the way there. This is going to tell you the order that the draft is going to go in. And then each round, it's going to flip, and then it's going to go in the opposite direction. So that's what that is for. Now, the way that the game works, you're going to be going through 4 different steps each turn. There's going to be a draft phase, event phase, a race phase, and a damage phase. So first, let's look at the draft phase. What's going to happen during the draft phase? We've got these 4 decks of cards, and they're comprised of different sets of cards. So you've got cards that have kind of this copper border to them. You've got cards with a silver border, cards with a gold border there, and cards with a black border. Those are all different types of cards. Now, the first 3 decks you see there, they're all more parts for your machine that you're going to be able to add on to make your machine a little bit better. The copper bordered cards, you'll notice they have these 4 little ports on them, and that means they're going to be easier for you to connect to your machine and get other things connected to it. When you look at the silver bordered cards, those are all going to be things that are going to generate more dice for you. And you'll see as we go through this why that's important. And then finally, the gold bordered cards, those are ones that are going to generate motion. So obviously we're in a race, motion very important. And then the black bordered cards are boost cards. They're kind of special actions that you can play during the game to do cool things. So what's going to happen when you begin the draft phase, each player is going to draw one card from the top of each of those decks. And to make it easier on myself, I've already taken and I've got my 2 stacks for the first round for my first 2 players. And then what they'll do is they will go ahead and look at the cards that they have. And they're going to choose one of these cards that they want to either keep or discard. And then they're going to pass the other 3 on to the other player. So there's a couple of things that I could do with some of these cards. So for example, with this card here, I've got a combustion chamber. And what it's going to do is when I put a yellow die in the slot here, it's going to then take and convert that yellow die, no matter what number is on it, into a cog and 2 blue dice. And I could easily take and connect that to my machine here. Now, you can easily and quickly rearrange the way your machine is constructed at any time to make room for new parts. So if I wanted to keep that part, I could take and I could just connect that up here, and then I would have that connected to my machine. I always have to have these connected so that it leads back to the cockpit somehow, some way. So I could do that with that card. The other thing I could do with this card, if I chose this one, is up in the top corner here, it tells me I can discard this card, and if I do, I can choose between getting 2 blue dice or 2 cogs. And here's the little cogs over here in this pile, and we'll talk about why those are handy a little later on. So I can keep it, I can discard it. Those are my 2 choices. With the boost cards, those I can either keep or discard like the others, but unlike the others, these aren't going to add to my machine. This mass ejection is going to do something for me during the game. And if I want to keep that, I put that face down underneath my little armor meter there, and then I can use that at any other time. So for sake of example here, I am going to choose to take this this combustion chamber, and I am going to put that into my machine. Now at the same time as I am picking a card, my opponent would pick a card. We'd reveal them at the same time and do what we want to do with it. So, you know, my opponent here, Thomas Edison, they would have their own stack of cards that they would be going through and picking one of those to place into their machine or discard for dice or what have you. So let's take a look at these here and see what we want to work with. Let's see, Thomas Edison, as is apropos for this inventor, looks like he uses a lot of electricity. So let's see if I can find a machine part that would benefit from him having electricity. I have a combustion chamber, just like I had in my other hand. And I also have some galvanic brakes that could use electricity to turn one electric die into both red dice and armor. Or I have some a drive wheel that I could take and convert steam dice into motion. So I think for my inventor, just for example's sake here, I'm going to go ahead and take these galvanic brakes, since I seem to generate a lot of electricity, and hopefully I'll be able to get something to use those red dice in later. So I take I'm going to connect that to my machine here, and then I would pass the other 3 cards over to Albert Einstein. And Albert Einstein would pass his remaining 3 cards over to me. And I apologize, my camera work tonight is terrible. I need to get like a camera stand or something. So that would go back and forth like that with the draft, where we'd both be picking 1 card to discard or keep, and then passing the rest until all 4 of those cards are used up. The next phase that we're going to go to would be the vent phase. Now, the vent phase is not going to apply the first round, but we'll talk about why the vent phase is important. As you notice on my machine here, I have spots to put dice into. So this particular machine part takes steam dice. So during the game, as I reach over here, I'm going to be able to put these dice into my machine. And let's say that they were a 5 and a 1 there. What those will do is they will power my machine. I've got 6 pips worth of dice there. You see the little 3 with the arrow. That means for every 3 worth of pips, I'm going to get 1 motion. But once I have those dice in there, they have to stay in there until I can vent them off. So the way that I vent those dice off is by using cogs. So earlier we were talking about cogs as something that could get me cogs. For each one of these little cogs, I can reduce the value, the pip value on one of these dice by up to 2. So for example, if I use 1 cog, that's 2 pips worth of reduction. I could get rid of the blue die completely, and then I could reduce my 5 to a 4. So that way, when there's this constant cycle of using dice to power my machine, but then later on I've got to get those dice out of there. It's like they're clogging up the works. They were good for me when I was using them to power my machine, but after they powered up the machine, they don't get used again, and they have to be vented off to make space in my machine again. Because otherwise, if all 4 of those slots get filled with blue dice, I can't use that machine part until I clear dice out from it. So that's definitely one of the balancing acts in this game. So that's what the vent phase is all about. Getting those dice, those pesky dice that were useful once to you, out of your machine and making room for more dice to go in there. So then the next step in the game is the race phase. What we're going to do is we're going to take any dice that we gained during the draft phase, because remember I told you can discard cards to gain dice, and we're going to start using those to power our machine. Also, with certain cards, usually the Inventor's Cockpit, they'll have this little icon for a light bulb right here, and I can trigger that light bulb by flipping my little light bulb marker from the green side over to the off side. And I can also get dice sometimes that way, like Albert Einstein. When I flip my light bulb, he'll give me either a red die, a blue die, or a yellow die. So again, my machine's probably not as powerful as it could be because I only did 1 step in the draft phase. I only drafted 1 card. So my machine has only got 1 extra part to it. But for an example, what I would do is, let's say for Albert Einstein, I said, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a blue die from his cockpit action, because I know with the blue dice, I can then take and power my machine. And let's just say, for example, too, that I also had these 2 cogs, I had 1 extra blue die, and let's say I had also a yellow die. What I'm going to do with those dice that are in my dice pool is I'm going to take them all and then I'm going to roll them. And then I get to choose during the race phase where I want to assign those dice to where they're going to be most useful and allow me to power my machine. So I'm looking at my machine that I've got here for Albert Einstein. I know that for every 3 worth of pips that I put into the steam turbine, I can get one motion. Well, that's pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead. I've got a 5 and a 2. I'm going to put those into my steam turbine. And then what that's going to do is it's going to generate, let's see, every 3 is 1 motion. I've got 7 in there. I don't get any change or anything like that. So I would generate immediately 2 motion. So I'd go to my racetrack, I'd find Albert Einstein here, and he's going to move 1, 2 spaces on the track. So yeah, I'm a little bit ahead in the game, and that's how I'm going to move. But now also, I've still got, sorry to swing back over here, I still got this yellow die with 3 pips on it. And if I look over to my machine here, I've got a machine piece that can use a yellow die. If I put this in here, that little asterisk again means that it doesn't matter what number die I put in it, it's always going to generate the same thing. So it's going to generate me a cog and 2 blue dice. So I'd go over here to my pool, I'd grab myself a cog, and I'd grab myself 2 blue dice, and I can immediately roll those dice. And now I can use those too. Ooh, 6 and a 4. So that's 10 worth of pips. I'm going to put those in my machine too. And so now 10 divided by 3, let's see, so that'd be 3 more motion. So I'd take Mr. Einstein here, and we're going to go 1, 2, 3. Now the one thing I have to be cautious about too is you'll notice here the one space I just crossed through, there's a little mountain looking icon there above it, and that's a hazard. And it's got the number 2 in that. So what that means is when I enter that space or cross through it, I'm going to take 2 damage to my vehicle. Ouch. So I've got to go to my little damage wheel here. Right now it's set at 0. I'm going to go -1 and -2. So now I have 2 damage on my vehicle. We'll show you how that affects me in just a little bit. But I'll tell you this, damage is bad. So I did not move Mr. Edison. We'll save some time there by leaving him, but at the same time as Mr. Einstein there is powering up his car and moving, Thomas Edison can also be doing his race phase at the same time, rolling dice, placing dice into his machine, making his machine go, generating more dice. So that then would mean that he would also be up here, and let's say he was moving here. Oop. You also notice too that sometimes there's a little fork in the road. So if Thomas Edison wanted to take a shortcut and get ahead of me, he could take that shorter path, but you'll notice there's 3 damage there that he's got, or 3 hazard that he's got to go through. So that's a little bit dangerous. So it's a choice you got to make sometimes. Also on these spaces, you'll notice down there in the bottom of this space, it shows -1 cog and a blue die and an infinity symbol. What that means is you can stop your movement there, and you can trade out cogs for blue dice as many times as you have cogs to trade. So that can sometimes help you in getting more dice to power your machine. All right, so let's say that now both of us have activated all the machine parts that we want to activate. We're both done with the race phase. I was telling you earlier about the damage that I was getting. Well, now it's time to pay the piper. Hi there, Teresa. Welcome to the Rick Rolls video show here. So earlier I told you that I crossed through some pretty rough terrain and I took 2 damage to my vehicle. So what I have to do then, for every damage that I took, I then have to discard a piece of my machine. Now again, my machine is probably not as buffed up as it could be because I only did 1 step of the draft phase. I would probably have several more pieces attached to my machine right now. But as it is, if this was my machine going into the damage phase, I would lose both these pieces of my machine. You can never lose your cockpit. You got to have that always. So both those pieces and all the dice that are on them would go into the discard pile. And now poor Albert Einstein has just got one piece of his machine left, and he's going to have to start rebuilding again during the next draft phase. Now, if it ever came to the point where your cockpit would be destroyed, let's say I had 3 damage as opposed to 2 damage, at that point, since I can't blow up my cockpit, what would happen is, well, actually, I can blow up my cockpit because they say that then your machine blows up. And what happens then is you have to go behind the very last player in place because you blew up and now everybody's flying by you Super Mario Kart style. And if I was in the last place and there was nobody to move behind, I would have to go one step closer back towards the finish line. So that whole damage aspect, especially I found when I was playing the game, is very, it makes you make some tough decisions because obviously a race game, you want to just put your pedal to the metal and go as fast as you can and try and get to the finish line, try and race ahead of everybody. But every time that you're trying to generate motion with your machine, you're also looking at the board and you're seeing what kind of hazards are there. And you're like, oh man, I could go this far. I could put this much dice into my machine and make it go further. But man, when it comes to the damage, I'm going to be destroying my pretty machine. And that's not to say that you won't ever make the decision to blow up pieces of your machine and leave them behind. It's a thing that happens, but obviously, you know, it's a tough decision when you've got a machine that you like or you've got pieces in there that are really beneficial and you don't want to get rid of them. So I found as I was racing, I was also trying to do things that would give me armor, because that's the one thing we didn't look at either is some machine parts can give you armor to add to your vehicle so that you have a little bit of a buffer against damage. Now, there was one other thing I didn't talk about with these cogs. And these cogs are not only good for helping vent your machine during the venting phase, you can also use these during the race phase. So as I was rolling dice and placing dice into my machine, I can always expend one cog, and for every cog that I expend, I can add a pip to one of my dice. So for example, I could change that 4, that blue 4, I could change it to a 5. Also, I could use the pip to re-roll. So I got that 2. Let's say I really didn't want that 2. I wanted something bigger. I could expend a pip, and I could re-roll that die. And now I got at least one more, but I guess I could have, in that case, just expended a cog to move it up one more pip. But that too, by the way, is the other thing that I found really challenging. I was, at first in my race, I was just chunking dice into my machine as much as I could. But then you get to the point where you're like, oh man, I can't use that machine part anymore until I vent it because now it's completely filled up. So, you know, there's this balance between putting dice in your machine, but also knowing if you want to use it again, you're going to have to be able to vent it out, which means you're going to have to be able to get more cogs. So that's one of the decisions I like in the game too, is deciding how far you want to go, how much dice you want to put in. And of course, the higher the number of pips, the harder they are to clear out, the more cogs it takes to get them out of your machine. So that's tough too. But anyways, I digress. So we've went through the draft phase, the vent phase, the race phase, and the damage phase. So once that's done, it's end of round. You're going to flip your little light bulb token back up, and you are going to return any unused dice that you didn't put into your machine and you couldn't store in your machine. You're going to return those back to the pool, and then you're going to flip this directional token, which, like I said, for a 2-player game wouldn't matter much, but this would then change the order of the draft phase for the next round. So there is more that I didn't really talk about today as far as playing there are some different icons, and I kind of put this card out here that gives you a help to know what the different icons are. And we definitely didn't talk about all those, but hopefully I gave you at least a decent understanding of how the game is played. And I will say that this game was a lot of fun for me. It's one that I would play over and over again. It plays pretty fast. It's relatively easy to teach. It's got interesting strategy choices to make, whether it comes to which cards you're going to take in the draft to put into your machine, when you're going to discard a card in the draft to get dice and to get cogs, because you could build your machine out and you could draft every machine part and you could make your machine really big and awesome. But then if you don't have any dice to put into your machine to power it, then what good is it to have a big machine? So you got to be getting dice. You got to be getting cogs to be able to vent your machine out. So you're going to have to discard some of these cards sometimes so you can get the effect of getting more dice or getting more cogs. So that was an interesting decision too. And then in my game too, when this whole mechanic of the first person to cross the finish line doesn't win, they just trigger the end of the game and then there's one last round. Well, when you take that into consideration, it's like, okay, well, I could cross the finish line this turn, but then once I do, I can't get much past it. And do I have enough stuff in my machine, and am I set up well enough for the next round to where I feel like I can still push ahead and win this game? Or is somebody going to come from behind and pass me and win the game, which is exactly what happened in the game I played against Jonathan. So he beat me by 1 space on the race. It was amazing. But it was a real interesting race. I shot out ahead in the beginning, then I kind of slowed down. He caught up and then was back and forth for a while, and at the end he ended up winning the game. So that is Steampunk Rally. I apologize for the camera, getting my finger in front of the camera sometimes and trying to get the right angles. It's very hard to film with holding the camera in one hand and then trying to move pieces and move cards with other hands. I'm definitely still trying to get the hang of that. But I appreciate you guys joining me tonight. And if you have further questions on Steampunk Rally, or you'd even like to get a personal demo sometime and have me come over and teach you how to play Steampunk Rally, I can do that. So thank you. You have once again been Rick Rolled, and I hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you.